Good afternoon, everyone. So I just got back from the theater, having gone to watch Dungeons and Dragons, and I'll admit I've been looking forward to this one. And I've always been a big Dungeons and Dragons guy, and I've been a DM for several years, running a server on Discord, a campaign that's been going for just as long as I've been doing DMing, essentially, about 3 years deep. And to start off with all this review, I just want to open with I really enjoyed this movie. It was great in a lot of ways, and we'll get into the details here shortly. Now, I want to approach this from two angles here. One as a proponent of D&D, and two as just a general moviegoer. To start with, as a proponent of D&D, if you are a player or DM in Dungeons and Dragons, there is a lot to appreciate here. There's a lot of attention to detail and understanding of the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And you'll pick up on a lot of references and name drops to things that are pretty well known to people who play D&D and know Faerun and the Forgotten Realms, that is the world setting that this takes place in. And the characters, the world, it all connects pretty well, and it doesn't disregard everything that exists in Faerun. And you'll see that happen a lot with adaptations where they take liberties to create their own thing and completely dismissing everything that's established. And Forgotten Realms especially, that's a world that's been around for ages. I think that goes back all the way to Gary Gygax in like first edition. I might be wrong on that. I'm not totally perfect on all the history of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's one of the oldest world settings I can remember in Dungeons and Dragons. But for the movie itself, I feel like the characters are all well acted, the story's well paced, and the character motivations, they all make sense. Everything plays well, as if almost like you were sitting at a table of Dungeons and Dragons. And when you're watching everything play out, there are things that are acknowledged within the mechanics itself of Dungeons and Dragons. So the way magic items behave, the way character abilities, in a sense, would work, the way the characters think about what they're capable of and how they engage is very much how you would expect to hear players talk at the table. And there were many moments in the film where it was almost a one-for-one to how some of my players have interacted at my tables. And that just made it a extra level of joy for me as a dungeon master of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, as a general moviegoer, can you go in and enjoy this not knowing Faerun, not knowing Dungeons and Dragons or anything about how it works mechanically? Absolutely. And like if you were taking your kids to it, there's nothing like super explicit. There's nothing super wild about it in that regard. It's just fun. It's a fun family movie, and it's a good romp through D&D as almost like a campaign. It's not like some super like global threat stakes kind of thing. It's more intimate in that regard, but by and large, it's like I would say maybe a level 5 campaign, maybe. If I guess unless you know D&D, you probably don't know level scaling, but it would be a regional campaign. D&D is kind of split into tiers where you have like regional, continental, global, planar in its threat levels. And I believe it's like 1 to 5 is regional, like 5 to 10 is continental, then 10 to 15 is global threats, and then 15 to 20 is like your planar, dealing with gods and things like that, where you're just throwing everything in the kitchen sink into the fray. Now, I don't want to give spoilers because this movie just came out, but I will say that the story itself made sense and played very well from scene to scene. There was never any moment in the film where I'm sitting back going, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. This character's doing something that doesn't make sense within their character. This villain is doing things that don't make any sense. Or I never really felt like the villains also just blew their own foot off, which seems to be really common lately, where a villain often like defeats itself. It does feel like it is the hero's journey, and it manages to escape some of those really typical tropes, in my opinion, that I half expected going into this. And I'm also happy to say that there isn't a ton of like modern politics and that kind of stuff going on. There isn't like force-fed messaging that's going on through the film. Really, it's like it's telling its story, and that's its focus. That's its job. You can tell that the movie makers did their homework on their world and what they were adapting, and stayed faithful to that source material. Take for example something like Rings of Power, where they're like, we love the books and everything, while they do nothing at all that honors that material. You can tell the guys that made this movie either were players, dungeon masters. They had a intimate familiarity with how D&D worked. Even in the flow of some of the action scenes, you can see to some degree like the turn flow of combat and how things pan out. You can kind of gauge the power level of certain characters and maybe make a somewhat educated guess as to what level they might translate to mechanically in gameplay. But each character was very adherent to what their class was. As we can see in the poster here in the background, there is the mage, there is the barbarian, the rogue bard, there is the paladin, and there is the druid. Now, each character very much acknowledges the abilities of their classes from Dungeons and Dragons itself, and they're very cognizant of those capabilities from character to character and how they hope for things to happen. And again, I don't want to give any spoilers, but there are some pretty great moments, especially if you're a player or dungeon master. You'll get a good appreciation for some of those interactions and dialogues. And the humor itself, you'll hear it often in reviews, like the MCU humor. If there's got to be so many jokes a minute and some very forced humor in a lot of areas, at least within Phase 4 of the MCU. But this isn't a critique on them, but it's, I guess, relevant. With Dungeons and Dragons as a film, the writing feels clever and witty. There are jokes that fit within the context of the world. They don't feel super like anachronistic, where they're behaving in ways that you'd expect them, like if you're walking around like New York or something. It's the humor feels very apropos to what is occurring in front of you, and it makes it a real joy to watch because it's focused. It's got a clear vision from the start of the film to the ending, and I think it's also got fairly strong messages when it comes to morals. It almost feels to me like it's harkening back to when films had a good lesson without really cramming it down your throat. There's definite messages underlying in the film and themes. And you're going to find that in any writing, but it's how you present those themes and deal with the playing out of those themes. The build up, the payoff. There are several things that if you're paying attention near the beginning of the film that are paid off later. And it's done really well. There's a lot of unfortunate happenings in modern film where you see the writers set up 100 different things and then they're completely irrelevant in the very next scene. Whether that's in TV, a series forgetting what happened in the previous episode, or a movie forgetting what happened in its predecessor, or blatantly ignoring or retconning it constantly. And that happens all the time, it feels like, in modern shows or movies, even to some extent in games. Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves doesn't do that. It acknowledges what's come in previous scenes, and it even, like, even in the opening, sets up certain things that are paid off later. And the opening sets the stage for the film in a way that also doesn't feel like forced and like super like exposition drop. It makes sense, like especially if you've played Dungeons and Dragons, you kind of know how this goes in a way. It's very much like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign opening, except it not in a tavern kind of thing. It's atypical in that regard, but I won't give any detail beyond that. So overall, to kind of bring this to a close, because without going into spoiler territory, there's not a whole lot else I can talk about. Well, actually, I guess there is. I haven't really talked about like the sound, visual effects, etc. I would say that the effects are honestly not bad. Now, there's been some atrocious CGI that I have seen, but this film actually, everything looked good. There were no effects that just had me kind of scratching my head or wondering like, wow, this looks awful. Like, what were you doing? And I've had those moments a lot with, and again, I'll reference the MCU. You know, you look at things like She-Hulk or Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, and it's rough, like really, really rough in areas. And you will not see that here in Honor Among Thieves. They actually have a pretty good aesthetic to everything. The armor looks decent enough. It doesn't look printed onto the material. Like if you've seen any of those screenshots of Rings of Power with Muriel's armor, where it's literally like leather printed scale mail. It looks horrible. It's just bad. Just take a look at the screenshot. If you know anything about armor, it's crap. But yeah, the armor actually looks like armor. I mean, some of the armor looks a little bit fantastical, but that's also D&D. It's to be expected, and it totally makes sense within the world. And yeah, the weapons, they look good. The magic items, they look, artifact compelling, interesting. They don't look just crazy generic. And even the spell effects as they're doing stuff, the wizard, he gets to sling around some interesting spells and stuff, again referencing spells from Dungeons and Dragons. And while they never really call anything out by name per se, as a dungeon master, you can kind of be like, oh, that was that spell, or I think that was this, or the druid does things that it's like, oh, they might be this class or this subclass within that based on these things that are happening. Like in the trailer, you see the druid turn into an owlbear, and I think it was pretty cool how diverse they got with the wild shaping, and really just with each of the classes' abilities. Though I will admit the paladin was fairly subdued in their magic, but then again, paladins generally are, unless they are dropping the unholy wrath of God with an epic smite for 400 damage, like you can see when they drop critical hits in the game. There was good use of the barbarian's martial attacking and action scenes. There was good use of the bard rogue hybrid, and he never really gets himself too in the thick of it per se, because he's doing exactly what you'd expect a bard and a rogue or a hybrid class there to do. They all are also super consistent in their behavior. I mean, really, really consistent. None of the characters ever feel like they forget who they are. And they carry that from the very beginning all the way through rolling the credits. And the character development, I mean, no one goes on like these super large arcs. There's a couple core protagonists that have their arcs, but overall, the characters are solid. They have their foundations, and they stick to them. And that is increasingly rare, it feels like, in modern filmmaking, where characters so often like just have amnesia, it seems like, from scene to scene. And it's frankly just kind of a testament to, I guess, how much these writers may have cared about what they were doing. And there's so many times in film where it just seems like they're phoning it in, where they really couldn't care less about what's happening. And you see that a lot in TV, movies, especially with sadly a lot of really old IPs that are like legendary in status, but are being like adapted to try and make a quick buck by studios. Things like Willow or Rings of Power, or it's kind of tragic what's happened to some of those franchises. So to see something really intelligently use its source material and stay faithful to it in that capacity and tell it a story that engages the viewer and leaves you feeling satisfied at the end. This is a movie I would go see again. You know, it's one I would pick up and add to my personal library of movies. It's a good film. And if I had to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, I think it's a good solid 9. I'm 8 at the very lowest if you want to get kind of nitpicky about certain things, but again, I'd have to get into a little more spoiler territory there. But even after leaving the theater on the drive home, kind of considering some of those nitpicky things I had, being a DM, I was able to kind of rationalize a bunch of those and be like, yeah, okay, that actually does make total sense. That's actually plays into this mechanic here or this mechanic here. They're not mechanics you might know if you're not a dungeon master, but as a dungeon master, it's able to be rationalized and made sense of. But even as a viewer just watching it, just like, oh, that looks cool, you wouldn't know any different. So my nitpicks are because I have that background, so you can pretty much ignore those if you're just a general moviegoer. You're gonna have a good time if you like fantasy films and kind of action comedy in a way. And it doesn't feel like super like it's like comedy where they're dropping jokes. They're well integrated into the film. They pay off well to the punchlines, if you want to put it that way. I did have several good laughs to the film. So again, overall, I'm gonna rate it a 9 out of 10, just for a couple little things that maybe would be a little bit, I don't know how to exactly to word it, but convenient at times. But again, I've had those kind of things happen at my table with my players' actions. So even though I can kind of nitpick in that area for me, which brings it down that 1 point, it's overall 9 out of 10. Solid 9 out of 10. And it's a film that you could safely take your kids to without a bunch of agenda here or there, left or right, doesn't matter. Just you're going to have a good time, and it's going to be worth your money if you go to the theater. Go with your family, take your kids, and you're going to have a good time. So thank you for watching, and I will be posting further reviews on films as I watch them, games, etc. So feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the bell there to be notified when more content comes out. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you next time.